May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be aligned with your love, O God, our strength, our courage, and our freedom. Amen. Today is the last Sunday in the church's liturgical calendar. And that is why we have just sung what I find to be a very helpful and hopeful hymn about endings, the end of time, the end of a season, even the end of life, when one of our temptations is to give our lives over to fear. And one of the messages of today's lessons and theology is to, in the times of endings, to give our lives over to hope. So we call this the reign of divine love in some parts of the church, Christ the King Sunday. But in our effort to try to get away from the dominating metaphors of our tradition, I think it is appropriate to start this morning's sermon with a small taste of what happened when my wife, friend Robert Winter, and I visited His Holiness the Dalai Lama 2 weeks ago at his residence in Dharamsala, India. Because the theme, the values of this morning's lessons and liturgy were incarnate and embodied in that particular person and in our visit. This brief report also provides a framework in which to say just a word about the horrible news coming out of the Philippines, continuing to come out of the Philippines as a result of the devastating typhoon, as well as the great news this morning of the diplomatic success, the breakthrough of diplomacy over warfare, expressed in the deal that Iran struck with 6 world powers over its nuclear program, and also the 50th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. So that's a huge agenda for this homily. So let's get started. When we were with the Dalai Lama, the time just flew. And what we expected could possibly be just a 5 or a 10-minute greeting turned into more than a 30-minute conversation, talking about a wide range of topics, beginning with our common relationship with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, touching on President Nelson Mandela, and also my spiritual guide in life, Thomas Merton. His Holiness first wanted to know how Archbishop Tutu is doing. We talked about the Arch's importance to you and me here at All Saints, and to His Holiness as a friend and fellow Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and as the person who actually brokered our meeting with the Dalai Lama. He also inquired about Nelson Mandela and how he's doing. I shared what little I knew. And then I mentioned that the day that we were there, November 8, 2013, marked the actual 45th anniversary of the 3 meetings that Thomas Merton and the Dalai Lama had in the same place where we were meeting that day. I mentioned that Thomas Merton, the great spiritual teacher, author, priest, and monk, who was killed accidentally just a month after he met with the Dalai Lama, when an electric fan fell on him after his shower and electrocuted him after a speech that he had given that morning to the monks and nuns gathered in Bangkok from both East and Western monasteries. The Dalai Lama later had said that his meeting with Thomas Merton in 1968 was one of the three most important meetings of his life, along with meetings with his Dharma teacher and Mao Zedong. I mentioned that Thomas Merton had been my own spiritual North Star when I felt spiritually lost in my life, whose writings had helped me find my way out of law school and eventually into the priesthood and then into the Episcopal Church, and that my wife and I had named our son Peter Edwin Merton Bacon after Thomas Merton. When I told the Dalai Lama all this, he breathed deeply. He sighed. His eyes filled with tears. And he spoke of how important Thomas Merton was to the world as a bridge between Christianity and Eastern religions, and that he, the Dalai Lama, had actually gone to Merton's monastery in Kentucky and had prayed at his grave site. I mentioned that I had met the Dalai Lama briefly once before in the green room of the Pasadena Civic Center here prior to one of his presentations. And the Dalai Lama at that point had mentioned that Merton had much shiny, and he rubbed his own bald head, referring to Merton's balding pate. The Dalai Lama broke out into a huge laugh at that point. He calls himself a professional laugher. And he mentioned that both he, the Dalai Lama, and I, Ed Bacon, had much shiny today. We went on to discuss his global leadership in advancing what really was Thomas Merton's lifelong project of exploring the values that are common in all the religions. Merton and also the Dalai Lama believed that when you go so deep into your own religious tradition that you strike oil down there, the oil of what we all hold in common in the world's religions, that being compassion and forgiveness and love for all sentient beings. The Dalai Lama and we spoke of advances in brain science, one of my passions, about what's going on in neuroscience, which is proving on the secular level, scientifically, the advantages on both the brain and the body when someone meditates regularly. He and I spoke of our own meditation practices. I meditate 60 to 90 minutes each morning, and he 5 hours a day. And he mentioned that he had gotten up that morning at 2:30 to pray instead of at 3 a.m. because he knew he had a full day of meetings. We also spoke about what happens when you die. He reflected respectfully, which is very interesting coming from a Buddhist monk, about the thinking that every human being carries within us a part of the divine spark. I thought, but didn't say, the first chapter of John's Gospel. That divine spark, when we die, rejoins God, and God thus becomes more whole. We live forever in God. I will speak more about the content of this conversation when I make a more official report in the Rector's Forum one Sunday morning in January. But for now, it's important to say that the Dalai Lama played with us. He joked with us and made fun of both our bald heads and overweight bodies. After the conversation part, he said he wanted to sit between my wife and me on the sofa where we'd been sitting, and he held both of our hands for a photograph. And then when we were getting up from the sofa, he turned to me and he said, "How much do you weigh?" He said, I just went to see my doctor and he told me I have to reduce. Maybe it's time for you to go see your doctor. We enjoyed such riotous laughing. and this surprising amount of physical affection. At one point, he reached over and took my hand and caressingly placed it on his cheek. And I did the same. Then he leaned over and made his forehead touch mine. And then after generous gift exchanging, there's this traditional imparting of a kata, a white silk scarf that he gave each of the three of us. And then he decided to give us a gift. And when he had to, then he gave my wife a beautiful jewel-encrusted red candy case. And when he gave it to her, he pointed to my belly and said, "Don't let him have any of it." Then he thanked us, and he had to move on through a very busy schedule. We left on clouds of blessing. And I began to just feel like I should spontaneously bless everyone I saw, which I did. I tell you that story today because it's my first day in the pulpit since the trip, but also because here is a person who was doing this in the face of his experience as a Tibetan who had been expelled from Tibet in 1959 by communist China, and ever since has been homeless, ever since has been dealing with that dislocation and that oppression. And in the midst of it, he comes in with great hope. I mean, that's what Jeremiah is trying to say in this morning's lesson. The world is in a hell of a mess. That's a loose translation of the Hebrew. And there's cause for hope. Because the world is in a hell of a mess because the shepherds in religion and in government have screwed it up, and they haven't been faithful shepherds. And so I'm going to tell you how I deal with their evil. I'm going to come in myself and create shepherds of justice and peacemaking and love and compassion and forgiveness in such a way that I will, God says, bring all the people back together. No one will be out of place. No one will be homeless. Everyone will be included, and there will be justice. In fact, they will call me Yahweh Justice. Yahweh meaning I am who I will be. Justice. That's been the shape of my week. One of the great things about living in my particular perch is that I get to sanctify my time, and everybody has an opportunity to sanctify their time. I get to sanctify my time by talking with you, representing you at other places, having amazing conversations. My life was shaped by this whole business of the world is in a hell of a mess, and yet there's reason for hope and love and compassion and forgiveness. Juliana Serrano, our director of the Office for Creative Connections, went to Northwest Pasadena to have a meeting or to participate in a meeting that was put on for men and women who recently have gotten out of prison. And there's this wonderful reintegration project which we support as All Saints people, helping men and women who've been in prison and taken out of society find their way back into society. And so there were all sorts of vendors about human services there, but also there were some inspiring speakers, and one of them, surprisingly, was Wayne Kramer, a great guitarist, part of MC5, a great musical group who had spent time in prison for drug consumption and dealing and other things, and he was out and saying that those of us who were in the room who had been in prison, and he talked about his recovery as an addict, those in the room who were recovering addicts had some stuff to share with the world. He didn't use the word stuff. He said, we know stuff. And don't you think that you can't be a resource to the world, he was saying to those people who had just gotten out of prison. You are resourceful in recovery and the arts. We know something that the world needs, he said. And then a close friend of mine told me about waking up this week with an amazing epiphany. This man in his business had taken advantage of him, truly taken advantage of him. And involuntarily, he had been holding on to a grudge all these months. And his epiphany was that for his own sake and his own liberation, he had to forgive this man, regardless of what that man ever came to terms with. He had to, for his own welfare, forgive in his heart. I went Friday to a class that I'm taking with a psychiatrist from UCLA who's one of the world's great neuroscientists, and he's part of this breakthrough neuroscientific research about the impact of meditation and mindfulness and interconnectivity on the brain and your body and your relationships. And he's a person whose help the Dalai Lama has sought out. And he was saying that our genes and also our epigenetic structure can make us have lives that are chaotic and rigid. The world is in a hell of a mess. And through mindfulness, a new body, a new brain, a new set of relationships are possible. And the last thing I'm going to mention, although there were more this past week, on Thursday night, Sheldon Epps, who is the executive director of the Pasadena Playhouse, came over so that he and I could have a conversation about this amazing play that's running in the Pasadena Playhouse called 12 Angry Men, which is cast with 6 black men and 6 white men. And they get into this jury room and hash it out. And the subtext is that racism is a reality. And Sheldon talked about how, as an African-American man who came in to lead a predominantly white organization in Pasadena, the Pasadena Playhouse, and when the Pasadena Playhouse got into serious economic trouble, on both occasions, when he first came and then when it got into economic trouble, that he got all of this hate mail saying that it was his fault because he was black. And he called up his detractors and said, let's have a conversation. And through the conversation, there was conversion. And so Sheldon was talking about, yes, we've got 2 realities. Racism is alive and well in Pasadena and in this country. The world is in a hell of a mess. And when you get people together for candid conversations, you can have conversion, and that can lead to consensus and transformation. The horrible, heartbreaking news out of the Philippines that continues to roll over us and break our hearts is how much this climate change fueled typhoon is damaging the lives of poor people. We have degraded our planet so much that we have passed to a point of no return. We are going to continue to have climactic crises, droughts, floods, tornadoes, typhoons, hurricanes. And this morning beckons you and me to work so that those who are poor don't get the brunt of this, whereas we who are privileged live so protected. You see, the other image of today is the crucifixion. If you can, suspend a lot of theology you may have about the cross. and see it as God's love letter to the world. Here's a person who takes the posture, a good shepherd who takes the posture that God always has, of arms stretched absolutely as wide as possible, to say, this is the size of God's love. This is the shape of God's forgiveness. This is the scope of God's compassion. I'm not doing it so you won't have to get into this posture. You get into this posture too. And Jesus says from this posture, God, forgive them. They don't know what they do. JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated on November the 22nd, 1963. Just a few short months after he delivered the most important and radical speech he ever gave. A declaration of peace and peacemaking in the face of powerful forces in the CIA and the Pentagon that tried to force war during the Cold War years at every point. Bay of Pigs, Laos, Cuba, and he outfoxed them every time. The world is in a hell of a mess, and God is calling us to be good shepherds of nonviolence. Kennedy wrote this speech and knew that he had to keep the text secret from the priests of the war-making system and the military-industrial complex. He declared in the speech that he, Chairman Khrushchev of the USSR, Prime Minister Macmillan of the UK, and he had agreed to high-level discussions in Moscow to reach an agreement on comprehensive test ban treaty. A treaty that he was able to sign before his death and got ratified by the Senate. He said in this speech, in the closing words, "We shall do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. The world is in a hell of a mess, and there is reason for hope." Confident and unafraid, he continued, we must labor on, not toward a strategy of annihilation, but toward a strategy of peace. There is heartbreak, oppression, and annihilation all around us this morning. Racism, addiction, a military-industrial complex, a prison-industrial complex, and many other things are our environment. And what resides in you and in me and in every human being is this deep capacity to love, which the Dalai Lama was embodying in our experience with him. Inside us all is actually an eternal spring of love that God has put inside of us and that is always flowing. There's never a time when the spring of love is not flowing in your soul. The problem is whether or not you and I are aware of and are accessing this spring of love and compassion and goodness inside us. And when we become conscious of this flowing, active love, and we practice it and make it our core habit, the people around us in our force field will feel its activity. All Saints is a big tent. Janine Scanoni and I were talking the other night. There are people here who believe that Jesus is divine, and there are people here who believe that Jesus is a holy man, and a whole bunch of other beliefs about Jesus. And all beliefs about Jesus, or the absence of beliefs about Jesus, are welcome in this big tent. I believe that no matter what you believe, that if the Christian life is anything, it is about this business of penetrating deep into our centers and becoming so transformed that you and I are accessing the divine love inside us, and that those around us can feel it in their lives, and thereby our life and our relationship with those other people prime the pump of love and compassion and forgiveness in their lives, and that active power, that font of love, works to transform the systems in this world that grind people up and spit them out. Systems of racism, sexism, bigotry against our LGBT siblings, climate crisis, economic injustice, the war-making system, the prison industrial complex, and general underservice to those who are poor and those who are children. Thomas Merton's last recorded prayer before he died was to ask all those Buddhists and Hindu and Christian monastics to hold hands. He said, I ask you to concentrate on the love that is in you, and that is in all of us. Then he said, I don't know what I'm going to say, but I'm going to be silent for a minute, and then I'll say something. And this is what he prayed. Oh God, we are one with you. You have made us one with you. You have taught us that if we are open to one another, you dwell in us. Fill us then with love. And let us be bound together with love as we go our diverse ways. United in this one spirit which makes you present in the world and which makes you witness to the ultimate reality that is love. And then before his amen, he said two radical truths. Love has overcome. Love is victorious. My sisters and brothers, if today invites us to anything, it calls us to embody those truths and to live in this posture, either in our dying, but especially in our living, so that we can be God's instruments of turning the human race into the human family. Amen.